Welcome to Generation Digital Workforce, the podcast that's here to explore the role of robotic process automation and other digital technologies. Whether you're just getting started or you're looking for advanced strategies and tactics, if you're curious about where human and digital workers are coming together to transform the future of work, then this podcast is for you. All right, let's get into the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome this week to Generation Digital Workforce. I'm Zena, coming at you from Austin, Texas, and this week I'm pleased to have with me Rick Wartzman. Rick is the director of the K.H. Moon Center for a Functioning Society at the Drucker Institute and the author of 4 books, including his latest, The End of Loyalty, The Rise and Fall of Good Jobs in America. Hi, Rick. Welcome to the program.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
I'm glad you're here. You want to tell our listeners a little about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity. So, as you mentioned, I'm at the Drucker Institute. We're a social enterprise based at Claremont Graduate University. Some would probably call us a think tank, but we do as much action and doing stuff as we do thinking. I always think think tank, you envision people sitting around and scratching their chins or things like that. We don't have time for much of that. We have a lot of things that we work on with different organizations across all sectors. So we work with companies, we work with nonprofits, we work with government agencies, and very much trying to help them be more effective and responsibly managed in all they do. And I'm happy to talk about more of that. And by way of background, before I came to the Drucker Institute, I was the founding executive director 13 years ago. I was a journalist for 20 years. So I was at the Wall Street Journal for 15 years as a reporter and editor, and then at the Los Angeles Times as a reporter and editor. And I've continued to write, over the last decade plus from my perch at the Drucker Institute.
Yes, that's actually how I found you. I came across an article that you wrote in 2014 that we're going to talk a little bit about in the show today. But before we jump there, I'd like to explore your thoughts a little bit about the shift in the workforce as we see it kind of moving in front of us right now. And, this program is about, how we as business people collectively need to think about the workforce and how it's shifting. But if we want to learn a little bit from, the past, as I know you've done a lot of studying and, how that shifts us and helps us look forward. Technology and automation isn't new. Shifts from in technology and automation aren't new. And the shifts from the analog to the digital world isn't necessarily new either. And in your past, you've studied and written about Peter Drucker's research on the rise of the knowledge worker. And I'd like you to share some of your thoughts on the trends you've seen impacting this set of workers most recently in, let's say, the last decade.
Yeah. So one of the things I think the moment we're in, many organizations are feeling trends that were already happening or, drifts that were already happening accelerated, right? I think in a lot of ways, many of us feel like, it's weird, right? We're all hunkered down, or many of us who are fortunate enough to be able to work from home and are still employed and have the luxury of being safe and amid a pandemic and working from home. In some ways, time has stood still, or, you don't even know what day of the week it is anymore. And in another way, for our organizations, I think shifts and moving online and, digital transformation, as people talk about it, all that feels like it's also sped up in a tremendous way. I know the way that I'm, connected now to my colleagues digitally has only been enhanced because I can't see them physically. And I'm sure this is true for many organizations. The way we serve our customers is been much more of an online or a digital environment, obviously, for folks. And so I think we're seeing an acceleration of trends there. And in turn, the way that as knowledge workers, we need to be responsible for the information that we generate, who needs to know, right, what we need to know, in what form, at what time, so that they can make decisions. You don't want to be the bottleneck, right, in a virtual organization because you're not responding effectively and appropriately in real time. So I think, again, we're seeing a lot of things sped up. We're also seeing, though, a real divide enhanced. That is, as I alluded to, for those who aren't necessarily knowledge workers, and have been now dubbed essential employees in many cases, who have to go into their places of work physically to serve people, whether it's frontline retail workers, grocery workers, those in an Amazon or a Walmart warehouse, school teachers perhaps coming up in districts where they will have school coming back online soon. All of those folks, healthcare, professionals, all of those workers who've been exposed in so many ways to the dangers of working, during this time of coronavirus, but also I think it's exposed real fault lines in our economy and society around those who don't get paid very much in many of those frontline jobs, who don't have access to sick leave or healthcare benefits. So a lot of things have been laid bare, I think, by what's happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. In your latest book, The End of Loyalty, you chronicle the erosion actually of the relationship between American companies and their workers. You want to share a little bit about your research and what it tells us about that relationship and how it's changed?
Yeah, I think that, the real arc of the story was, there was kind of this expectation of really lifelong loyalty between employer and employee in this kind of post-World War II period up through really the early to mid 70s. You worked hard for your employer, and this was folks, in blue collar jobs or, white collar jobs. You were taken care of in many ways. You would often work for decades at a time for a single employer. You'd have this long tenure, and then even when you retired, about half of all workers had guaranteed pension plans that really was in some ways the fullest expression of this idea of lifelong loyalty between employer and employee. They took care of you for the rest of your life. Access to good benefits, ever rising wages. This was a period of the creation of the great middle class in America and the consumer class in America. Wages really did rise right along with productivity through the 40s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s. And then that social contract, if you will, really began to unravel. And there were all kinds of forces that caused it, including the shift to knowledge work and the decline of manufacturing, decline of unions and worker voice and power, technology and automation, globalization, all kinds of forces. And then I think one that really accelerated those trends and exacerbated them and exacerbated those pressures was kind of the rise of shareholder primacy and beginning to put shareholders before all these other stakeholders, including employees. That was really the gasoline on the fire, if you will.
Yes, agree. When the return of profits became the number one key performance indicator for corporate success.
Yep. And look, companies have always cared about profits, and they should. I mean, if you don't care about profits, you're not going to be in business very long. And you're not going to, frankly, be able to afford to be a good employer or a good neighbor or a good contributor to society or a member of your community. But from my study of what's happened historically and where we are today and the issues we work on at the Drucker Institute, it's become clear to me, along with many other organizations and allies in this fight against shareholder primacy, that there's an inordinate weight that has been put on financial returns and short-term financial returns, again, often at the expense of other stakeholders that traditionally were better served by corporate America. There's been, as you know, a bit of a return to this thinking, not only by, folks who've been pushing on this like myself for a long time, but, most visibly by the Business Roundtable, right, last summer. And their 181 CEO members signed a statement that specifically renounced their previous statement endorsing shareholder primacy, and they've now embraced stakeholder capitalism as a better way to go. And I applaud them for doing so. I think there's still a lot to be seen as to how you take that talk and turn it into the walk, but it's good that they've at least taken the first step and acknowledged that was an issue and have at least pledged to do better.
Step number one. So that's a moving in the right direction. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about automation, which is one of the things that we talk about here on the show in bringing out a digital workforce. And automation and the ideas of artificial intelligence and can often be polarizing subjects. And, in some of the research that Drucker did himself, he viewed automation, as a mixed bag.
Yep.
But he also wrote that technology impacts, which the experts predict almost never occur. And I think you and I have probably found that to be true in our own careers as well. So, how do you think automation is impacting what we're seeing right now going on with the knowledge workers or with the workforce in general? And is automation having the impact that it should or that it could in helping us to get back to stakeholder capitalism?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll take it in those two pieces, I guess. So in terms of, first of all, AI or automation, often, lumped together, although obviously different things. I think nobody's immune. No job category is immune. And in fact, it's often thought of that the most vulnerable are the most vulnerable when it comes to automation, right? Those on a factory line or, perhaps right, a checkout person at the, your drugstore who used to be there and now you check out yourself right through a automated scanner or whatever. And we've certainly seen a lot of that. I mean, you can't look at a factory photograph and look at a modern factory now and look at a photograph of a GM assembly line from years ago, and they often look quite different just in terms of the number of people packed into a plant, and it takes far fewer hands to produce the stuff that we used to produce from a manufacturing standpoint. So those folks have in many ways over a lengthy period of time been disrupted and seen jobs disappear, also seen new jobs created, no doubt. But if you're on the losing end of that proposition, that's tough. But again, I don't think anybody's immune. There was an interesting study that was done late last year by the Brookings Institution that working with actually a Stanford PhD student named Michael Webb. And he looked at the way different job descriptions are categorized on ONET, the government's official occupational database, looked at the words they used and then to describe a job, and then looked at I think more than 16,000 different AI patents and matched the specific words in those patents and found that many white collar occupations are also very vulnerable to AI. So no one, I think, is, safe in a sense from having their, job disrupted at least and maybe replaced, right? In many cases, I think we'll be working side by side more with machines, and in other cases, it may be a wholesale substitution. So which sort of gets to the second part of your question, which is, what's it mean in terms of a company's obligation to prepare their workforce for that and sort of deal with that in a way that makes sense for society and certainly, I think, for the economy long term and for their own self-interest long term. And, what we've seen in terms of the erosion of the social contract between employer and employee, many pieces of it have declined over the last 40 years. Again, as through a number of reasons and as shareholder primacy has taken hold. So we've seen wages stagnate. We've seen benefits like healthcare and retirement security erode steadily over those 4 decades. Another area, though, that we've seen decline by and large is employer provided or sponsored training for their workers. There seems to be some change to that may be underway. The numbers are very hard to come by, but the best numbers that have been done most recently still suggest an overall decline in training. And there have certainly been indicators in recent years that are not really very encouraging in terms of companies being in a position or willing to train their workers to embrace this new digital future. So to be specific about it, there was a 2018 Accenture survey of some 1,200 CEOs and other top executives. It found that 75% of them intended at that time to automate tasks to a large or very large extent, but fewer than 3% of those C-suite executives said they would significantly increase investment in training programs to help their workers learn to work in tandem with these machines or deal with these machines. So you look at that kind of gulf and you just think, wow, that's not a very good recipe for those who will be left behind. And that concerns me greatly.
That brings up an interesting fact that I remember reading somewhere, and maybe it wasn't a fact even, but it quoted somewhere around, that 20% of the jobs that will exist, 10 years from now don't exist today. So, how do we prepare for the unknown world? And there's some, automation is right in front of us. So I think it's easy for executives to grasp onto, well, yes, I'm going to be automating because everybody else is automating as well. I must be doing this. So you see 75, percent saying that. But training and investing in the future is a little bit more nebulous when you don't exactly know what to prepare people for.
Mhm.
What do you think? How do you think these businesses should be thinking about preparing those employees for the future when they're not even sure what those future jobs might be today?
First of all, I think that they do have a sense of what the most immediate jobs are like. And we do see some companies, doing a lot of training. Walmart is actually a good example, and historically has, not been seen as a leader in terms of providing for their employees, but they've invested heavily in training, and they are under a digital transformation. As they use even their brick and mortar stores. It's kind of this blended experience. You now can order online and then go pick up at the store, but their employees in turn need to be trained to pick out those items quickly, to restock in ways they hadn't before, to know you're in parking spot number 3 and this is your order, and how to load it in your gather the items and load it in your car and all of that. And there's all kinds of technology involved in that, and they're training their people accordingly. Verizon is in the midst of retraining. I mean, they've made a conscious decision during the pandemic to not lay off workers, but retrain some 20,000 of them so that they're better prepared to serve customers in their stores when business picks back up, because they have a sense of some of the new technologies and digital systems that are going to be implemented. So I think companies do have a sense of certainly what's on the immediate horizon and can do a better job. I wish there were more Walmarts and Verizons out there. And there's some. AT&T's done a lot in this area, IBM, Amazon, but I still think they're probably the exceptions. We need a lot more of this. The other thing I would say is that, and Peter Drucker talked about companies becoming and turning themselves into both learning and teaching organizations. Another really good source on this is Deloitte's Center for the Edge has done a lot of work in this area. And it seems to me that what companies need to do is invest in a way, one, their employees pick up a good general skill set of, certain soft skills and other skills that will be transferable no matter sort of what the specific technology is, but that will teach them some, fundamental ideas and concepts that will probably translate well no matter what specific technology or system is implemented. And then as part of that, maybe the most important thing is sort of cultivating in people the habit of learning, and cultivating in people this idea of lifelong learning and continuous learning. That's something that I think employers can provide and is more essential than ever.
So I'm curious your thoughts on the idea of the gig economy, which I've seen a lot of younger technical tradespeople, I'll use that word, gravitate towards. Not really, and I think it's goes back to a little bit around the idea of the end of the lifetime relationship between a corporation and an employee. But this idea of more of a freelance where you don't really work for corporate America, but you have multiple quote unquote gigs. And I see more of the younger generation sort of gravitating towards that. I'm wondering if you're seeing that, your thoughts on it, and if that's an inevitable shift, or if you think we'll see a reemergence of a loyal list type relationship.
Yeah, I do think it's a growing trend, although I think it's also one that gets overblown a lot. So sometimes you see numbers by, certain organizations, freelancers or gig workers or whatever, that suggest 50% of the workforce is headed toward being some kind of gig worker. And I think those numbers are just way off from all the best studies that I've seen, both official government data and work that Larry Katz and other economists have done, leading economists. That would all suggest that about 15% of the American workforce, at least before the pandemic, I don't know what it all is now. Things are so up in the air, been thrown up in the air, but about 15% of the workforce was in some form of contingent work. And that's the term that embodies not only, those who are freelancers, but are temp workers or some kind of contract employee, that kind of thing. And so it's not as big as sometimes the numbers indicate. Those who work for an online platform, right, is even smaller. I mean, it's 1% or even a fraction of 1% in terms of the total workforce. So it's not nearly as big as some of the headlines and the numbers would have you indicate, and so I'm thinking of Uber and Lyft drivers, right, on an online platform. That said, gig work is growing over time. It's also become an important kind of backup occupation for people. So, right, people who are employed but then supplement their income. And in many cases, as that main corporate social contract has eroded, people have been able to smooth out their income and increase their income through gig work. So it's become something of a personal safety net. The other thing I would say about it is, and I think this is really, really important, gig work, if you want to call it that, is where we see this divide that exists in the general labor market as really starkly. And there's been some interesting surveying that's been done over many years. And what it essentially finds is this, that if you are somebody who is at kind of the high end of the gig market, if you will, so I am a freelance tech consultant, or I am a, contract financial analyst, or, something like that, and it really is something I want to do, it can be great. You have a lot of flexibility. Maybe you have health care through an employed spouse. Your life is pretty sweet. You can be paid well. And again, the flexibility is fantastic. If you are a contingent worker or a gig worker because, and you're kind of at the low end because you're a care worker and get your work through a temp agency all the time, or you're a contract worker because you used to have a job at company X, but they, got rid of everyone who worked in the cafeteria or the janitors, staff, and they're outsourcing that work, and you get your job that way. You tend to be very low paid. You have no benefits. You have no safety net, and it's terrible. And you see a real split between kind of the gig haves and have-nots in that way. It's very, very pronounced.
So how would you suggest we move past the gig economy or that we really embrace it in order to make it work for everyone?
So there are efforts underway, which I think makes sense, that, to have things like portable benefits. Certainly universal health coverage in this country would help not only gig workers, but, we have this it's really a weird historical artifact and it's still, most people get their health coverage through their employer or their spouse's employer, right? We have our access to medical care tied to employment. We're, an outlier as a nation in doing that. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think it makes a lot of sense actually for business either, that shoulders all these healthcare costs and has to deal with all this administration. So, having whatever form of true universal coverage you had, whether it's a public option or a single payer system or whatever it is, I think we've got to move towards something like that. But not only for gig workers, just for all the other frontline workers, the tens of millions of workers who have been so left behind over the last 40 years. I think that's essential. And then again, portable benefits, having gig workers the ability maybe to organize in some way and have more of a collective voice. But again, that's something I'd also say is as essential or certainly or maybe even more essential for those who are employed directly by organizations and have watched private sector union coverage in this country declined from, a height of around 30% in the 50s to 6% or so now. And so these are things that I think would be good not only for gig workers but all workers.
Definitely agree. So we've been talking about some interesting trends that have been going on recently, or maybe even more than recently, last 20 to 50-ish years. One of the reason I reached out to you was a article you wrote in 2014 that was actually titled "What Peter Drucker Knew About 2020," and I ran across this article on HBR actually just a couple of months ago when I originally reached out. And so it was very interesting to me, written 6 years ago, about what he knew this year. And it was actually rang very true. I encourage people to go out and read it. But in there, you said that the increasing productivity of the knowledge workers was the most important contribution management needed to make in the 21st century. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how we're doing in driving productivity of our workers, and what automation or technology and in general's role is in either moving that forward sideways, or maybe not moving it forward at all.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I would suggest, even though I wrote that piece 6 years ago, by the way, it was based on Peter Drucker's writings of much earlier. So he was the one who was truly prescient, right, to be able to see the world so far ahead.
Yes.
The term knowledge worker actually in 1959 in his book Landmarks of Tomorrow, which is really incredible, right, when you think about it. The idea of, he foresaw this of knowledge work and this knowledge age that we would now be very much, in the midst of. He really was incredibly far seeing. And then again, the ethos was very much around, right, blue collar work and the manufacturing worker and the factory. But he saw this different age coming. And I think his point was that, as he wrote over the years, and he spent the next 40 years really writing about what it meant to be in the midst of a knowledge economy, a knowledge society. And he saw that when blue collar productivity rose in the factory, that is what ultimately created it was the first thing that allowed the creation of the great American middle class and a growing middle class in many ways around the world, because the pie grew, right? As productivity increases, that's what allows people's standards of living to rise. The pie grew. And I think he thought that, and we would need the same thing to happen in a knowledge age with knowledge workers for the pie to continue to grow. My sense is that actually, I don't think growth and productivity is necessarily the problem. There are a lot of economists, as you know, who debate whether we're even good at measuring productivity now, that we miss a lot of things, right? So the famous example, or a famous example some point to, is how do you measure the contribution of productivity of Wikipedia, say, right? Or something like that. Or, I myself then feel like I'm way more productive since my office went on Slack. Or, there are 1,000 productivity tools I could point to. I'm not sure any of that is picked up in the productivity data, because the output of knowledge workers is so much harder to measure, right, than the productivity out of a factory. So it's hard stuff to count. And there has definitely been concern that productivity growth has slowed and so on. And so I don't mean to dismiss any of that. And Robert Gordon from Northwestern has done tremendous work in this area. And I don't mean to downplay the lack of productivity growth, but I'm not sure it's as severe as people make it. What concerns me way more is that, to the degree productivity has grown over the last 30 years, again, the pie has grown. It's now the question of how have we as a society, how has corporate America chosen to divide up the pie? And that's what's really changed most dramatically, is that equation.
Yeah, that equation has gotten a little off. Agree.
It's actually gotten way off. So, just to be specific about it, right? So from the late 40s, this is all data. It's a famous chart for, folks in my circles, right, from the Economic Policy Institute. But it's pretty straight ahead math. Productivity from the late 40s to the late 70s grew by, this is for, well, I'll explain in a sec. So productivity grew 108% from the late 40s to the late 70s. Compensation, so both wages and benefits, total compensation for a typical worker. So this is about 80% of the American workforce, okay? So this is production workers or non-supervisory workers in the private sector. So about 80% of the American workforce. Their compensation grew 93%. So roughly speaking, they tracked, right? Productivity up a little over 100%, compensation up over 90%. They just marched in lockstep, which is to say the pie grew and workers shared in that growing pie. They got their cut. From the late 70s through 2018, the latest data available, productivity didn't grow as much, okay, but it was up about 70% over that period. But total compensation, so this would even include like rising, healthcare costs in there, compensation grew only about 12%. So this is that flat compensation or flat wages, that we've seen stagnation in recent decades. Or to put it another way, the pie still grew quite a bit, but even in this knowledge age, maybe not as much as before, but it still grew quite a bit. But workers just didn't get their slice as they did. And if you look at the share of income going to workers, they've gotten less, and capital, shareholders have gotten a lot more.
So we've talked about the trends that have driven us there. How do we go in a different direction? We're in this age of digital transformation. I think a lot of the things going on have contributed to the digital transformation, things with the rise of the knowledge worker, automation, a lot of the things we've talked about. And yet the pie is growing and the share is not. Businesses are starting to shift, as you mentioned at the beginning of our call, to having a stakeholder capitalism view. So I'm curious, what do you think are some critical things that business people today should be thinking about within their businesses of how to make sure that we have worker equality?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, there's some different things that I would encourage companies and executives to think about. So one is, again, really focusing on training and even, be willing to invest in folks, even at risk of losing them, right? There's always a thing of like, why should I pay to train somebody and then have him or her just walk out the door and go work for a competitor? I think you need to take a longer view than that and kind of a broader societal view, which again is, I think, in a company's own best interest over the long haul. There are also some smart ways to go about it. I've seen some innovative programs where different employers have banded together in, certain regions. There's some interesting stuff going on in Wisconsin, I know, around this. I believe in Michigan, in certain communities where they form a collective to train workers in their community so that the costs are shared, and then there's, again, less risk. I mean, if somebody bolts, that your competitor's employee or, others workers in the community have also been similarly trained, and, everyone's it's a little bit of social insurance, if you will. Another thing I'd really focus on are the metrics that you track. What really matters to you, and there's a whole bunch of ESG metrics that you can track. There's a lot, though, around workforce that can be monitored, and I would encourage you to make it public. And I think the day is coming when this is mandated anyway by government to make some of these things public. What is your turnover? How does it stack up against those in your industry? Is it too high? If it's high, what does that tell you about, what kind of culture you have, what kind of place it is to work? I think that there are ways too that then you can tie some of those things to compensation. Most executives tend to be compensated beyond their salary if there's some kind of bonus structure, or certainly for very senior executives, some kind of stock-based compensation, tend to be very heavily weighted or strictly weighted to financial metrics, right? What other things can you be measured on, right? How about how much training you're doing and what the outcomes of those investments are? What about other workforce investments that you can make and the ROI on that you can look at in terms of changing your compensation structure? So those are a couple ideas that I think would help a lot at the corporate level. And then I think government can do a lot, as I said. I mean, there are many big things they can do in terms of enhancing the safety net, which I think needs to happen in terms of healthcare and retirement security and other things. Also in terms of trying to make wages stronger through an enhanced earned income tax credit for lower income workers and so on. But I think government can also encourage companies to do more of the right thing. Right now, investments in training are strictly treated as an expense. They're not treated as an investment in an asset. And so just in the way companies get favorable tax treatment or are able to literally look as buying a machine as an asset on their books, they should be able to do the same thing in terms of investing in human beings. So I think there's a lot of government policy that can help nudge companies the right way.
Excellent insights, and really appreciate your sharing those with us, and appreciate your being on the program today and helping us to take a look at our human workforce. As you know, we talk a lot about the digital workforce on this program, and I think it's really important to consider, the impacts to our human workforce in the rise of the digital workforce and how that is, impacting our businesses today. So thank you very much, Rick, for joining me today.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And again, if I'll leave you with one Peter Drucker quote, which is that a healthy business can exist in a sick society. And so again, I think it really is incumbent on executives to think about these broader trends and how their own actions and those actions of their company are creating in the broadest sense, a healthier place for all people to be able to thrive and flourish.
Great. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today, and look forward to you joining us on a future episode of Generation Digital Workforce.
You've been listening to Generation Digital Workforce. If you want to hear more about RPA, AI, and other cognitive technologies that are shaping the future of work, join us next time as we continue to go deeper on these topics with industry innovators and experts. To make sure you never miss a future episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. And if you've liked what you heard today, please leave us a review. It's one of the best ways to help more people find valuable content. For show notes and more info, visit us at blueprism.com/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.